Yves Doutriaux is a professor of geopolitics and a former deputy representative of France to the United Nations. He joins me now to talk a bit more about all of this. Yves, what do you think about this reform of the UN Security Council that was proposed by the French president, expanding the UN Security Council from 5 to 11 permanent members? Is it a good idea?
Yes, by the way, it's not new. We have said that for the last 20 years. When I was a deputy ambassador in New York, beginning of the 2000s, it was already a French proposal. We support, as it was said, Germany, Japan, India, Brazil, and now two African countries. There is a need to enlarge the Security Council for it to better correspond to the reality of the world of today. We are no longer in 1945, but today. And it's clear that we need more dialogue with the South, with Africa, with India, big countries like this, in order to be able to have, joint decision on peace and security.
So given all of that, I mean, will it ever happen? Or is the Security Council just too elitist to let it happen?
I think the US position has evolved, and that's good. But now we have to convince China and Russia. That's perhaps much more complicated. For instance, China could oppose to the permanent membership of Japan or even of India, because they are more or less strategy enemies. So we need to have the agreement of the 5 permanent members in order to enlarge the group of the member of the Security Council. That's a challenge.
It is a challenge, but do you think it will ever happen, or is it just a pipe dream?
I am not that optimistic. As I said earlier, after 20 years of discussion, given the fact that the world of today is much more divided than the world of 2000, we saw that in Ukraine or in the Middle East, I'm not overconfident that it will happen soon.
Well, this is in regard to the Security Council, but what if we broaden it out? I mean, what about the UN as a whole? Is it still relevant today?
I think it's relevant. Never before has been more useful direct contact between ambassadors, ministers, head of state and government. The world is very dangerous. If we don't speak to each other, even if we are not able to reach consensus in a minute, it's always good. Look, Macron spoke with the president of Iran yesterday in New York. So UN, it's a forum where you can speak even to those that you never meet. You can meet them in New York. And beside that, speaking about climate change or economic development, there are a lot of things done in the UN, including, by the way, in the World Bank and the IMF. So all these institutions should be preserved in spite of the fragmentation of the world of today.
Absolutely. But then what would you say to critics who perhaps say the UN doesn't really seem to be doing anything, particularly in war-torn countries, besides making calls for things like ceasefires that never happen?
The problem is not the UN. The problem is a lack of consensus between the regional powers. Look, Middle East, you have Iran, Israel, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and others. Look on Ukraine, you have Russia. So lack of consensus between regional powers and lack of consensus between big powers. And this is the issue of veto. Russia has vetoed many times any resolution of the Security Council on Ukraine. US has vetoed some recent resolution about Gaza and Israel. So when you abuse of the veto, you are not able to reach a consensus. And this is not because of the UN. This is because of the lack of cooperation between big powers.
Given that, I mean, here we are almost at the 1-year anniversary of the war in Gaza. Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister, is going to be addressing the UN tomorrow. The Palestinian president speaking later today. Is there anything that he can say, the Palestinian president, Mahmoud Abbas, that might get someone like Benjamin Netanyahu to change his mind? Get the international community to do more?
The problem is the policy of Netanyahu. On the one hand, you have the 7 October last year terrorist attack of Hamas, killing 1,200 Israeli, including French people, by the way. But now you have this war, as you said, nearly 1 year of war in Gaza, with a lot of collateral victims, and that should stop. And by the way, it's interconnected with what is happening today between Hezbollah and Israel, because Hezbollah is launching missile rockets against Israeli civilians in so-called solidarity with Hamas. You see how everything is interconnected. So it's very complicated. If there is no good cooperation between big powers, why not Russia, China, put pressure on Iran, for Iran, put pressure on Hezbollah, and the US put pressure on Netanyahu to end all this, not to speak about moderate Arab countries like Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and so on. So the problem is the fact that some in Israel and in Hamas and Hezbollah consider that only violence could settle a conflict.
Jean-Yves, thank you for sharing your expertise with us. Jean-Yves Doutriaux, thank you very much.
Pleasure.